First, an introduction. The approach to understanding people by studying them from a lifespan perspective is to see their lives as a continuous unfolding story where there is connection, growth, development and change throughout the lifespan. Now, you understand, of course, that when the Bible looks at people and seeks to understand people, it doesn't take quite this approach. The Bible doesn't lay out our lives as a continuous unfolding story of connection, growth, development and change throughout the lifespan. Connection, growth and development, connection between each stages and growth towards maturity. See, this whole study of the lifespan is based on observation. Theorists have observed people living. They have observed babies and infants and children and so on all the way up, and in making those observations they have come to some conclusions as they've plotted those observations, as they've charted those observations, they've classified those observations. They have come to an understanding of what's significant for each of these lifespans and what has to happen in each of these lifespans to ensure a trouble-free transition into the next one and into the next one. So what we've done is we've kind of adopted their approach of considering the results of that kind of understanding and research in order to understand from their observations how we can help people in each of these lifespans to develop spiritually in their walk with Christ. Every span affects the one ahead and is some way impacted by the ones behind. So you take childhood, for instance, what you see happening in the life of a child, and these are the primary school years. These are the years between nappies and hormones. That's this period here. And what happens to a child here, you see, is influenced by how well they have completed the tasks back here. And that in itself will, as you observe the child, you'll learn some things about what happened back here, and you'll also gain some insight on how they're going to handle things up here. You see? And you can do that at any stage because there's connection. And what happens in any one stage is an indication of what's happened previously and what you can expect to happen in the future. So it can be a very profitable course of study. And we can see, for instance, if we can anticipate something happening here, we can anticipate where they might go in the future based on what's happened in the past. You see there's an opportunity there for repentance, for past sin, and an opportunity for hope as a renewed trust in Christ, a hope for the future. Repentance has a focus on the past, hope has a focus on the future, and faith has a focus on the present. Seen in this light, the pastoral counsellor is able to identify and highlight unusual or abnormal experiences of the seeker, that's the one who's come, and to discern developmental lags and environmental factors that may be contributing to the presenting problem. So you may have an adolescent who presents with adolescent issues. You may have a parent who presents with a child or even with an infant, and they're concerned about their child, concerned about their infant, and you have the opportunity to talk to the parent, you have the opportunity to talk to the infant, you have opportunity to talk to the child and seek to understand what's going on in their little hearts, and ways that you can bring their hearts closer to the reality of Jesus as their hope and their comfort. So as we get a greater understanding of what goes on in these different stages of the lifespan, you see how that will equip us with the questions to ask regarding any presenting problem in order to ask questions that extend the presenting problem out to factors just beyond what has been spontaneously shared, and so gain ask them questions they wouldn't think of asking themselves, so that somebody here, for instance, struggling with crisis in middle age, you ask them questions about back here, you see, and you ask them questions about up here, and suddenly you're addressing the middle age span in terms of their whole life. You see, most of us think about our lives in terms of what's going on today and what's going on tomorrow. If you ask someone to do something 3 weeks from now, they'll probably say to you, well, can you give me a text just beforehand and remind me? You see, 3 weeks is just a bit too far out there for us to hold it all in our heads. Now, if you ask someone to do something in the next 3 or 4 days, you could probably get away with that. And most of our diaries have, you know, a week on one page, any more than that, and our lives get too cluttered, you see. So we tend to operate in the present and then the immediate future. In fact, the future is so immediate, it's almost like a continuation of the present. So we operate as present people. Now, if we have a struggle with something, I have a struggle with you, or I have a struggle with circumstance, I have a struggle with situation, I tend to view that struggle in terms of what's going on in my life right now in the present. You see, if I'm having an argument with my wife, for instance, I'm all caught up with what's going on in the moment of the argument. Now, in the midst of that argument, say I'm up here. Well, somewhere around here. See, in the midst of that argument, I'm not thinking about my life experiences back here as having anything to do with that argument, as contributing to that argument. See, I'm not thinking that way. We don't generally. But you see, when God looks at our life, He just doesn't see the present that we see. He is Alpha and Omega. He is beginning and end. When God looks at your life, He sees everything from the very beginning to the very end. He sees it all in the single moment. He sees it all in the eternal present, in the everlasting present. So when God sees me having an argument with my wife, He sees that argument in the total story of what He knows about me. See, time is not an issue for God. He doesn't divide His knowledge of me into past, present, and future. For God, it's all present. It's all real. It's all truth. So what happened to me back here is something that's true about me. You see, an unexamined life is not worth living. Whatever happened to me back here, that's something that's true about me. Now, if I'm going through some kind of a crisis up here, going from middle age to old age, that could probably be a crisis for some people. You see, if I'm going through a crisis up there, God sees that crisis in terms of what is true about me. He sees it in terms of the truth about Peter Reynolds. Now, if Peter Reynolds doesn't see it in terms of the truth that is about me, then I'm not seeing my issue as God's seen it. That's where we need the Bible. The Bible will help us to view the whole of our lives as God sees our lives, in His truth. Therefore, putting away falsehood, let us speak the truth to one another, for we are members of one body. So, you know, someone might say to me, why are you asking me questions about my past? Why would they even ask that question? Because they're totally tied up with the present. Here they are. They're having a early adulthood. Here we go. These are the never years. You know, these are the 20 and 30-year-olds in the never years. Young children, heavy mortgage, trying to develop a career. Never enough sleep. Never enough time, never enough energy, never enough money, never enough love, never enough of anything. See, it's the never years. So here we are, caught up in the never years, and they're struggling with living in this kind of, when's it all going to stop, and, you know, what can I look forward to, and so they look with dismay into the future, and so you come along as a pastoral care person, and they're talking to you. Now, this just might be a cup of tea on Sunday morning. You say, how are things going? And they say, oh, well, you know, been a rotten winter for the kids. They've been sick, and we've been up all night, and you know, oh really, how's that affected your marriage? Well, I hope you wouldn't have asked that, but it hasn't been that good, you see. And so you start asking them questions about you know, about the relationship, about the history of the relationship, perhaps. Or you might, if you have the opportunity to extend the conversation, you might ask them questions about how they've handled crises in the past, how they've handled difficulties in the past. You see, you try and establish a pattern of what happens for them in transition. You see? And they might say to you, why are you asking me questions about my past? Now, why would they ask that question? They'd ask that question because they're totally focused on the present. The presenting problem is the issue. Don't move off the issue and ask me questions about my past, because that's totally unrelated to the presenting problem. That's totally unrelated to what's happening here in the present. You see, that's not a truthful perspective on life. That's like looking through the keyhole into a room and saying to yourself, what I see through the keyhole is the sum total of what's in the room. You look at a person's life through the presenting problem, that's the keyhole, you see? But that's not the sum total of what's going on in the person's life. Everything from start to finish is the truth about what's true for that person. Just before we start looking at conception and infancy, I just want to say something about these 3 clocks, to which we must add a 4th. And I'm just mentioning these because these 3 clocks all appear in the literature, and we must add the spiritual clock, the biological clock. Here is the physical growth that is common to all of us. All of us have to grow up physically with bodies that are created for maturity. From the time of conception on, we're in the business of growing towards maturity, and that's something which is true for every human being, and it's true because God has ordained that we be created for maturity. We aren't created to remain in infancy or in childhood. And so it's in God's good providences that we inevitably have to move in this direction. We can't stop that movement, we can't try to hold it back. Even though you have 40-year-old men still living with their mothers, see, they're trying to hold it back. They're trying to hold on to something which inevitably they have to lose and move forward into responsible adulthood. You see all kinds of examples of it. Back here you have an adolescent, you see, that won't go out at night. It won't go out at all, just stays at home. And is, you see, they refuse to move into the responsibilities of adulthood. We're made for maturity. The biological clock. The family environment provides the strongest influence on the seeker's willingness to accept their physical development. That's especially true in adolescence. What's going on in the home will have a huge impact on how the maturing person understands and accepts their process of maturity. As you move, for instance, from childhood through puberty into adolescence, that is a transition that brings a crisis for the child. It's also a transition that the child is going through that brings a crisis for the parent. The parent is facing a crisis at the same time the child is facing a crisis, and so both of them are in crisis, and neither are handling the crisis well, because neither of them saw it coming. Neither of them expected it. When they're 6-year-old and when they're 16-year-old, why should there be any difference? This is the parent talking, you see. When they were 6 years old, all it took was an ice cream. Now that they're 16, it just gets too complicated. Just can't figure out what they want. What are they concerned about? You see, there's a transition with the accompanying crisis. Now, to the extent that the family environment can handle the crisis that comes with that transition, to that extent there will be a productive, a mature, authentic movement in maturity from one lifespan to the next. Now, you can see what happens if, for instance, a child goes from childhood to adolescence within the home environment, relatively trouble-free because of the dynamics of the family. Then you can see what the family is setting that child up, that when they go through their subsequent transitions in life, maturity transitions, when the family of origin is no longer such a big feature in their lives, they're going to be able to handle it better, perhaps, because of the experience back here. You know, here's when children are primary school age, they're chained to their parents. In fact, in infancy, you can sometimes see them on a leash in the supermarket, see, so they don't run away. You see, that's physical, it's also metaphorical. You see, they're actually so totally connected to the parent, and the parent is making every decision for the child. Every decision about what they wear, what they eat, where they go, when they go to bed, when they get up. Every decision's been made by the mother, by the parent, for the child at the stage. Now, you can't do that here. Any parent who's been through it knows, and all of us have been through it as adolescents, we know that you can't do that there as a parent. You can't make all those decisions for the child there that you made back here. You can't tell them what to wear. You can try. You get a fight on your hands. Now, the parent is faced with a crisis. What are they going to do with this? The child, in order to become an independent adult in their own right, in adolescence and early adulthood, is beginning to step away from that parental control. Now, the parent sees the child stepping away, and the parent goes into panic mode and says, I'm losing my child. You know, I'm losing them to the world. I'm losing them to an unbelieving friends. I'm losing them to whatever, you see? And all the child is doing is stepping away. What's the big deal? It's just one step. You're still right there. The child doesn't want to cut the relationship with the parent. They want to turn the chain into an elastic band. They just want to stretch it out a little bit. And they'll come back in and they'll stretch it out, but they don't want to cut it. The parent thinks the child is rebelling and leaving and taking off. And you know, at 18, they'll walk out the door and take 18 years of your life with them without a backward glance. You see, and it's terrifying. You try to pull them back in. Well, we're created for maturity. The family environment provides the strongest influence on the seeker's willingness to accept their physical development, especially in adolescence. Here's an adolescent who has a lot of trouble, say, with acne, or with as their physical appearance is changing, they feel very ashamed about that, very nervous about that, very reluctant to go out in public, very reluctant to be seen in a social setting, except with people they can trust. The adolescent suddenly decides they don't want to go to church anymore, and the parent thinks they're facing a spiritual crisis, but in fact the adolescent is simply over anxious about that new pimple that appeared overnight, or over anxious about the fact that they suddenly realize they don't have the kind of clothes that the other kids at church have. And you see, how's the family going to handle that? Help the adolescent to accept their physical development and change. The scriptures expect us to welcome our physical reality, to thank God for it, not to shrink from it, hide it, or be ashamed by it. A biblical view of what it means to be masculine and feminine will help here. Now down here in infancy and childhood, of course, the fact that the child is male or female is not a big issue for the child. Well, it is if you're Freudian. But generally speaking, for the child, it's not a big issue. The child is coming to a growing awareness that there is a gender difference, say, the brother has from a sister, the sister has from the brother. But in terms of their self-understanding of their place in the world, gender differences aren't significant until you get into here, adolescent and early adulthood, where the tasks of dating and mating, see, become the tasks of this period. And if those tasks are not performed in a God-honouring way, they launched into middle age with a disaster on their hands. So how are we going to prepare an adolescent girl for early adulthood? How are we going to prepare an adolescent boy for early adulthood, for that transition? And you see that the parental understanding of gender issues for the adolescent become paramount. The father's relationship with his teenage daughter, the mother's relationship with her teenage son. You see how significant it becomes? The teenage boy feels smothered by his mother's constant attention. She's desperate not to lose him, yet he wants to know that he has an appeal with girls, with females, other than his mother. In other words, he needs to get out there and reassure himself his mother's not the only woman in the world who loves him. See, he needs that reassurance because he's growing into man. He's aware of his growing manhood. He's aware that one of the great tasks for him is to make it with the woman, and he needs the reassurance that he can do it with others beside his mother. The teenage girl, as she faces her adolescence, she faces the growing maturity of her femininity. She knows there's no escaping it. She knows that men are looking at her differently than back here. She's aware of things she wasn't aware of back here. And as she goes out into her world, how's she going to deal with that? Well, you see, the relationship with her father becomes absolutely paramount. You see, because at that point, you see, in adolescence, if the father seeks to know the heart of his teenage daughter, and he loves her by reaching out to her heart and listening to her teenage concerns and listening to her teenage fears and connecting with her heart. What's he teaching her? He's teaching her that the man for you is the man that loves your heart. It's the man who pursues your heart. It's the man who wants to love you for what's on the inside. You see? So when a guy starts coming after her for her body, her antenna will go up and she'll say, no, this is not what I want. I want a guy who'll come after me for my heart. because I learned that from my father. Now, if the father never does that with his teenage adolescent daughter, then the girl is left wondering, is there anyone out there, any guy out there that will love me for my heart? And so she goes out looking. And she tries any way but which to try to sort all that one out and see if there's a guy out there that can love her as she longs to be loved. And if she hasn't had that experience from her father, then she'll go looking for it from other guys. See how powerful this is? See, the family home is can the family home handle the crisis of moving through transition? Here's a mother. You're talking to her after church, and you know she's got a family of teenagers, and you say to her, "How you doing?" and how things going. And she said, "Well, I'm really worried about Johnny," and Johnny's 16. See, I'm really worried about Johnny. You know, he stays out late at night, and I think he might be taking drugs. He's getting around with this crowd that his father and I certainly don't approve of. And then the mother kind of has a little bit of an epiphany, right there on the spot. And she says to you, because you've done the counselling course at Grace College, ha ha ha, she says to you, "Why don't you have a talk with Johnny? See if you can find out what's going on. Maybe he'll talk to you," because, you know, I'm his mother. "Maybe he'll talk to you. Maybe you," and you say, "Well, I'd be happy to talk to Johnny. What would be your purpose in me talking to Johnny?" "Well, maybe you can sort Johnny out. Maybe you can find out what's wrong with Johnny, what's going on with Johnny." And so, you know, meaning maybe you can restore Johnny to the family unit so that we can go on as we've always gone on, being a happy family together and Johnny a part of us. See, what she's done is identified Johnny as the problem. He's the identified patient. Sort Johnny out and we can be a happy family again. You know, as parents, you know, say to their teenage kids, "See what you're doing to this family by the way you're behaving? You see, you make the child responsible for the breakdown in the family." Who's responsible for the family staying together? Not the teenage child, but the father, who's the spiritual head of the family. He's the one responsible. Now, you see, if it's the family dynamic that helps the adolescent to move from one stage to the next, and the adolescent is acting up in this stage, then what the adolescent needs is for the whole family to come together and ask themselves, what can we do to help Johnny move through adolescence into responsible early adulthood? What's going wrong in the dynamics of the way we relate as a family that's causing Johnny to act out? Now, Johnny may be doing sinful things in Johnny's own heart, responsible for God for the sin that he's doing. But you see, maybe if you start looking at the family dynamic, you may find that Johnny has a very difficult relationship with his father. And if the father was to change in the way he related to Johnny, perhaps a lot of Johnny's issues just might go away and Johnny's behaviour might change. But you wouldn't know that unless you ask the questions, unless you step into that and have a good time messing things up. Biological clock, social clock. This is society's way of keeping time. Whereas the biological clock is something we see in Scripture. Social clock is a social construct that society puts on its own people. It's a society's way of keeping time. Society has expectations such as school, marriage, children, work, retirement, for instance. You take baby boomers. After the Second World War, the soldiers came back and there was a baby boom. And because of the social clock, government policy for the next 50, 60, 70 years was built around baby boomers. And so they anticipated when they would have to make huge investment in schooling to account for the baby boomers coming through, when they'd have to make big investment in infrastructure and business and industry so there would be jobs there for the baby boomers when they came through, when that cohort moved through like a tsunami. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Zoom, you see, and superannuation. You see, baby boomers are just ready to draw their retirement and the government has to prepare for that. See, that's the social clock. That's society's expectations on people and making provision for that, anticipating that. There will be variations and differences between cultures and cultural changes over time as to expectations. If you're talking to someone from a different culture from your own, their social clock may be different from yours. For instance, in some cultures, some Asian cultures, the expectation of the social clock is that girls will marry very young and just out of high school perhaps, and their parents will have a large say in who they marry. See, that's a cultural expectation of that child's social clock. And if you're talking to the child or you're talking to the parents, you see, you have to take that on board, because you're not going to be able to change their social clock. However, cultures will often be at a variance with the scriptures as to social expectations. So if you think, well, no, this is not right, they should just back off and leave the 16-year-old girl alone to grow up, instead of pressuring her to marry this boy that you've picked out, and you say, no, this is not right. Or you have a social expectation that in your culture, that when a couple gets married, they leave the family home and start up another one. And in this culture, the expectation is quite the opposite, that they will stay together with the parents and the girl will join the husband's family of origin, and so on. And so, as Christian caregivers now, we have to go back to the scriptures with our social clocks and with their social clocks and decide what the scriptures require. Psychological clock. This one's unique to each individual. This refers to the inside drive we have for growth and development, our own inner schedule. This is what goes on the inside of us. Now, what is it that drives human beings to do things and to achieve? Why is it that a dog doesn't have an inner drive to build an aeroplane? Now, this is non-Christians observing life. And here's a human being driven to do things, and here's a dog who's happy to lie in the sun all day and just flop his tail every time you go by. What's missing in the dog that the human being has? Well, that's the psychological clock. That's the inner drive we have for growth and development, our own inner schedule. As we move through here, we have different objectives and different desires which grow and develop and mature. So here's an infant or a child who has a desire to take his building blocks and build an aeroplane, or a little girl who has a desire to change her doll's dresses, at a constant rate of knots, and try all different kinds of variations, and now they're up here in middle age, and they don't have these same desires. At 50, he's not playing with blocks anymore. He's actually building aeroplanes. See, or it may be totally different. He may be building houses, or he may be an accountant, or he may be a labourer. See, but there's an inner. At each stage, there's an inner drive. There's a psychological clock that's driving people with motivations, and now we know that. The Bible talks about that. The Bible talks about our heart, which is the seat of our motivations, which is the seat of our desires. You know how that goes. You better be very careful what it is that you want, because inevitably you'll get it. So powerful is that inner drive and inner desire. And the scriptures talk much about bringing the desires of our hearts in subjection to God's law and to God's will and to God's scriptures. So that at each stage along here, you see, each stage along here as Christian caregivers, we can bring the scriptures to bear on the desires and motivations of the heart. The Bible requires us to develop a heart of wisdom rather than a heart of foolishness. Such developing wisdom can be seen and encouraged throughout the lifespan. Whether the child is 8 years old or 88 years old. The heart doesn't grow old, only the body. So the heart can still be counselled. The spiritual clock. This is the one we must add, since it's absent from the secular literature. Here is the spiritual development of awareness and understanding a person will have at each stage of the lifespan of God, the gospel, their own sinfulness, and what it means to entrust their lives to Jesus Christ. At each stage of the lifespan, appropriate evidences of spiritual growth and understanding can be sought. So here at infancy and childhood, what are the appropriate things to look for grown spiritual understanding and maturity? Here in adolescence, what are we looking for? over here on old age and old age, what's the appropriate evidences we're looking for spiritual growth? And this spiritual clock becomes the perspective by which to view the other three clocks in order to bring every aspect of life under Christ's Lordship. Okay, any comments or questions you'd like to have about those clocks? Yes, sir.
Burger has three, I'm not sure if it's related to these clocks, but it has three categories that it looks at each stage under. The biosocial and cognitive and psychosocial or something like that.
Right.
Is it related to these clocks?
It's not an exact one-on-one correlation. Those are, we talked about those terms last week. They're more kind of general, kind of big sweeping, big picture terms. These clocks are really more concerned with trying to understand the process of maturity. And so each clock is operative all the way through life. But there's certainly a lot of overlap with the concept of those other terms, the cognitive and the social. You notice that there's no cognitive clock. There's that would be under the biological clock.
It's almost like that social is under all three of them, because it's really the social expectation of one's biological function and the social expectation of one's psychological
That's right.
and cognitive function.
Yes. Yes, so they're divided out for the purpose of understanding, pedagogical purposes, but in fact, you know, we know that in actual fact, they all function together in the unity of one person. So we make these efforts to divide out that which cannot be divided. We make these distinctions which in fact are theoretical distinctions, not actual distinctions. So that's where we get in this. Well, does this distinction line up with this distinction? Well, none of them line up with reality at all, in fact. All of it is working together. But by dividing these out like this, and we're going to look at some of these theorists in a moment, what they've done with these different clocks. My lectures aren't necessarily based on Berger. Think of Berger as background reading to these lectures. The lectures is what's examinable. The readings are background readings. So they won't. It's not a lecture on the Berger reading. Anything else you want to say about anything I've said so far about these clocks?
Spiritual clock. With the current counselling system in place now, not seeing the creator, and but going on by researchers in the past, and the conception and intimacy between a young family coming together, and the building blocks which impart between both parents to address those needs as a child is more or less aware of. As they grow, they become a part of his natural tendencies to grow into, like timings, those things put in place, which now become, well, television, radio, outside the worship and prayer time, and opposing to education within a public schooling system, then what is, as we address in prayer, all kinds of prayer, whether for joy, to glorify God, or to about healing and the processes, and then stepping out into society, and then being oppressed with the actions and inactions between others and those who are non-believers.
Along here. Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? And you know, I've talked about the spiritual clock here in terms of Christian spirituality. You'll appreciate that, particularly since the time the Berger you're reading was published, there's been a lot more awareness of a person's spiritual life, and in the non-Christian literature now it's beginning to creep in. You know, we need to take account of the spiritual or the whole person or holistic approach, and respect the person's faith commitment if they have one, and so on. Well, let's start talking about conception and infancy, and you know, conception here is basically a small paragraph. Infancy is because conception and pregnancy is hidden away. Unlike infancy, which is out there to be observed, much more attention has been focused on the infant than the in utero child. But anyway, the story of the lifespan begins with conception. In pregnancy, where the child spends 9 months undergoing initial development, particularly of the brain and nervous system, you know, as well as the body. But you know, you appreciate there's not a lot of bodily development. In the womb, it's mainly brain and nervous system. Most of the bodily development comes after birth. However, genetic and environmental factors can impact fetal development. Such development disruptions as cerebral palsy, fetal alcohol syndrome, Down syndrome, spina bifida, can be detected during pregnancy as interruptions to the natural lifespan development of the unborn child. Some of those things are related to the mother's behaviour, alcohol for instance, or even cigarette smoking, or taking drugs of any kind. Down syndrome is a genetic one. Fetal alcohol is an environmental factor. So a combination of either environmental or genetic factors will affect and impact on fetal development. And the fact they can be detected during pregnancy raises then that issue of whether or not the child, if that can be detected, if the child ought to be aborted. And the reason given is because that child, if it's born with those arrested fetal development, will have a lot of trouble transitioning through the lifespan the way a child without those fetal abnormalities. So the argument for abortion is really based on crisis and transition. They're not going to transition well. They'll be faced with crisis, and it'll be a crisis for the caregivers, for the family, throughout the child's life. And there, you see there, it's the quality of life becomes a deciding factor rather than the sanctity of life. And quality of life is the ability to make it through the lifespan relatively trouble-free. Well, let's look at infancy. Infancy is from birth to speech. So this is birth here. That's where they're born. Right through to speech. From birth to speech. At this stage, the family or caregivers are the most powerful unit of change and nurture, especially the mother. All the tasks associated with this stage, walking, talking, initial knowing, and initial attachment, are all impacted significantly by the family dynamics. So while we've been born for maturity, yet the walking and talking and knowing and all that you see is so much influenced and impacted by what goes on in the family, the encouragement the child gets, the amount of involvement in the child's life. So if if a mother comes to you and she's concerned that her child's not reaching its milestones, her infant's not reaching their milestones, you might want to ask some questions about the family dynamics, what's going on within the family. There's, there may be a medical factor, she goes to the GP, but what you're able to do is ask questions of the relational dynamics in that child's life that might be contributing. Infancy and childhood stages of the lifespan have been the subject of much study and theorising. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the significant thinkers in this field. Just before we do that, I just want to pass out infancy therapy issues. So if you're involved in family counselling, for instance, of a family with infant children, these might be some of the therapy or counselling issues that you would could be looking out for. Problems with physical development, delays, genetic effects, illnesses, environment. That could be ignorance, they just don't know really how to look after the child. Child's failure to thrive. Sudden infant death syndrome, the death of a child, that could be a therapy issue that you'll encounter. You're counselling with parents who have lost a child through SIDS and dealing with grieving. You see, what you have to do is help them through that transition, and it's a transition they weren't expecting to have to make, and it's produced a huge crisis. And you know, as we saw last week, that a trauma that's not comforted is a trauma that will remain. And so there's a real necessity for them to be helped to move through that grief reality. Another huge infancy therapy issue is child abuse. And the recognition, say, of physical abuse, unusual injuries, unexplained or poorly explained injuries, repeated injuries, presumption that's on our part that the abuse has not occurred. Well, they're such nice people, I can't imagine them hurting their child. Just got to watch out for that. Even the best of parents, you know, reach a point where they really do fear they may harm their child. Presumption that abuse has occurred, so beware of a presumption that it has occurred or assumptions that it has not occurred. Just have to ask questions. That also applies to sexual abuse, only we don't have here the things to look for there. Responsibility to report, self-reporting, and who investigates. That's if you does the police investigate, does SIPS investigate? If you're involved with these kind of cases, you just need to know all that stuff. Now, we talked quite a bit about sexual abuse last semester, about what to look for in childhood sexual abuse. This is childhood physical abuse. Okay, well, let's move on then. Let's look at, we're going to look at Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, Piaget, Jean-Paul Piaget, and Kohlberg. And we're going to do Piaget and Kohlberg next week. This week we're going to look at Freud and Erikson. Now, again, the reason I'm looking at these guys is because they appear in the literature, particularly in this early stage of the lifespan. You'll appreciate there's a lot of work has been done in these areas. Where people have spent hours and hours and hours observing infants and children and trying to understand what goes on cognitively and socially. So let's look at Freud. Freud believed that the motivating force behind most behavior is the internal drive for physical sexual pleasure. He defined the physical pleasure mainly in terms of sexual pleasure. And Freud believed that that was something that was right there in infancy. The child was motivated in its behavior and its drive for sexual pleasure. Freud's theory of personality is therefore referred to as psychosexual. He saw the id as our inner instinctive or subconscious need, drive, instinct, or desire. These are what lie behind our conscious behaviors, the ego, which is our conscious behaviors. However, the ego comes up against the mores, the punishments, the taboos of society, which results in inner conflict, anxiety, and turmoil. The superego represents that place where the individual has come to terms with the inner drives and society's norms and now lives as an integrated person. Let me just attempt to put all that into a diagram for you. might be more helpful to understand. So if this triangle represents the personality, there's the id, and there's the ego, and there's the superego. And the id is the subconscious, the inner part of us, which has these, how's it described there? Our inner instinctive or subconscious needs, drives, instincts, and desires. So here are the needs, drives, instincts, desires, and Freud would say that they're all of a sexual nature. And it's these needs, instincts, and desires are seeking to come out of the subconscious where they're hidden, out into the conscious, into the life, which is the ego. So these needs, instincts, and drives are seeking to come this way, and the ego is our conscious living. And but as they seek to do that, as they seek to express themselves and exert themselves and come out, what they're faced with is the expectations of family and society. And so what happens is you have these expectations are bearing down this way. So the expectations of family and society are bearing down on the ego and saying to the ego, this is how you're expected to exercise, for instance, your sexual desires. And the id is coming up like this, saying you should be able to experience your sexual desires the way they were naturally designed to be experienced, that is without restraint, you see, and so that creates the conflict or the inner turmoil at this level here. So the result is conflict, inner turmoil. And Freud says that if you have hours and hours and hours of psychotherapy from a Freudian counsellor, you will eventually graduate up into here. You'll resolve this tension, and you will find yourself up here where the superego or the existentialist experience of being a fully integrated person, no more inner conflict. You understand about your sexual desires, you understand how to express those sexual desires in a way that meets society's expectations, and now you are a sexually mature person. Now, he based all this on observation. And you can see, for instance, in our society, how over the last 50 years, this tension, the sexual tension in our society in the last 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, has resulted in the cultural expectations shifting to accommodate the basic desires and instincts. See, as we've seek to remove all constraints on moral behaviour, all constraints on sexual behaviour have been removed. Now, this Freud would say is our society moving to the superego. We are coming to terms with the fact that these inner sexual drives are something which we have to accept and learn to live with and accommodate, rather than trying to outlaw, criminalise, suppress. So, you see, New Zealand society's bought into this big time, hasn't it? And has moved helter-skelter in that direction. Freud went further and separated out the stages of personality development based on the different zones of pleasure, hence psychosexual stages. These personality milestones for Freud were oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Let me just hand this out for you. What are we learning about Freud in a Christian college? Now, you see there's Freud, Erikson, Piaget, Kohlberg. We're just doing Freud and Erikson tonight, so you need to hang on to this, bring it next week, because we're going to do Piaget and Kohlberg. Now, here's Freud's psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital. And you see they're matched with the ages. Now, we're doing conception and infancy, birth to 18 months, that's oral. Now, since we're not going to come back to Freud again after tonight, I'll just run through all of these. where the behavior, the child's behavior as observed, centers on those areas in their body which gives them pleasure. So the oral, for instance, the oral is the first one, where the child's initial experience of pleasure at the beginning of their life comes by way of the mouth, breastfeeding, obviously, you see. And so what happens? Very soon after, the child puts his thumb in his mouth, because all good things come through the mouth. That's the oral stage. You know, the theory goes that if a child doesn't move from the oral stage, they'll spend the rest of their life putting things in their mouths in order to find pleasure. Cigarettes, you see. What are you smoking? You see, and it's or alcohol. You see, in other words, that maximizing pleasure comes via the mouth, and so. And so someone who's an alcoholic, for instance, or addicted to cigarette smoking, for instance, Freud would say they haven't transgressed past the oral stage of infancy. They haven't made a natural transition in their movement and maturity. So we have to go back, you see, and somehow readdress that deficiency, the oral stage. The anal stage, that's potty training. In potty training, the infant realizes that it's all about the anus. You see, why are they on the potty? Well, this is not the mouth anymore. It's now moved to a different part of the body. Now it's not what goes in, it's what passes out. And the child understands very quickly that when he's put on the potty, or she's put on the potty, mother is going to be very pleased if something passes out the anus. You see? And so the child understands that mother's waiting, you see? Mother's waiting. And when it happens and it falls into the potty, mother's very pleased, little clap, perhaps a little reward, little hug, you know. Johnny's a good boy, Susie's a good girl, you see. And the child is learning that pleasure socially comes by way of the anus. Now this is all Freudian, mind you. It's all fascinating, but, you know, do what you like with it. Now, he would say that if someone is arrested at the anal stage, what it means is the child now realizes they've got a choice. This is the 18 months to 3 year. At the potty training stage, 18 months, the child's got a choice. I can hold on or I can let go. If I hold on, mum will be mad and I'll be in control. If I let go, in other words, do what's supposed to be done into the potty, then mother will be pleased. Now, Freud would say, this is, you know, you heard that term, this so-and-so has an anal personality? You see, Freud would say that if the child never moves through that anal stage, where the whole potty training thing becomes not so much a crisis, but more of a natural thing which they can enjoy and then move on from, if that never happens, you see, then they'll spend the rest of their life either holding on or letting go in order to control their environment. Holding on and letting go socially. Holding on or letting go in terms of their interactions with others. I was speaking to a guy recently, and I was talking about, you know, his relationships, and, you know, he's a fairly self-contained kind of individual, socially, fairly self-contained, and he acknowledged that he'd probably have to let people in more. And I said, what do you like at letting people in? He said, oh, not too good. See, he just kind of holds himself in. See, he doesn't open himself up. He doesn't open himself up for the sake of others. The 18-month-old who doesn't open up the bowel for the sake of the mother, you see, but holds on to it. Someone who's going to grow up trying to control their social environment by holding on or letting go on their terms rather than the terms of the people they're in relationship with. So someone who's not naturally open and inviting relationally, but someone who is very self-contained and perhaps a little bit cynical, perhaps a little bit superior, perhaps a little bit contemptuous of others. Freud would say that goes all the way back to the anal stage where they held on and enjoyed getting it over mother. The phallic stage, that's where the child discovers their genitals, and there's pleasure in discovering those and playing with those. In the latency period, 6 to 12 years, remember now, Freud's thinking sexually. Freud would say in the 6 to 12 year period, that's between nappies and hormones, and right in here, that sexually nothing happens. Sexually they're dormant. Sexually it's a latent period. There is no sexual development. There is no development of body awareness and how they can use the awareness of their body to control their world, to control their environment. Until they reach 13 to 23, which is adolescent, early adulthood, then the storm breaks. The sexual storm breaks, and genitals are fully developed. Sexual awareness, sexual drive is fully developed, and they're going for it. You see, and this is, Freud would say, this is essential for the dating and the mating and the propagation of the species. After that period has passed, and they're in presumably a stable sexual relationship, then Freud, you see, has nothing after that period. He has all those blank boxes on the column. For Freud, progress, development, maturity finishes at age 23. There's nothing more to be expected after age 23. All the development has taken place that's going to take place at age 23. Now, he would say that because sexually there's nowhere further to go sexually. You've come to full awareness of your sexuality, and you've had full experience of expressing your sexuality. And if, and later in life you happen to, divorce and remarry, or have an affair, or sleep around, you're just acting out something which you already knew back here. It's not a new development of your sexuality. Okay, that's Freud. So in those stages, oral, anal, phallic, latency, well, not so much latency, but genital, he would see this is the tension that's going on all the time. And the parents' norms in terms of the child's sexual behaviour has been reinforced further and further, and more and more obviously as those years go by. So by the time the child reaches adolescence, this is what Freud's saying, this is why, the adolescent wants to break out, see, and express themselves sexually without the restrictions of family and society, or family and church. Now what's missing in Freud's theories, obviously, is that it's not all sexual, for a start, and others have picked up on that, but also what's missing is that during this period of birth through to 23, there can be a spiritual development of that individual growing more and more into Jesus Christ, and growing up into Jesus Christ, and their sexuality, along with every other aspect of their life, grows up and matures along with their spiritual maturity as Christians, so that this tension is largely reduced. It finds its expression in their union with Christ. Okay, anything you want to say about Freud?
Why did you say that ego was then?
The ego is our conscious behaviours, and the id is our subconscious desires.
What's the restriction from society?
Or society's restrictions on sexual behaviour?
Is that included in the ego?
Pardon?
Is that included in the ego?
Well, it's what presses down on the ego from society. This is a two-dimensional diagram. If it was a three-dimensional diagram, we could have, probably be more accurate. Mark, these arrows should probably come in from the side like this, on the ego, from society, family, church. But the idea is that the two meet in the ego and the conscious behaviours and create this conflict. So how should a teenager express themselves sexually? Well, Freud would say they're caught between their desires of the id and the expectations of society. And unless they resolve that tension, they're not going to graduate to superego. They're going to remain in that tension. Now, the Christian, the Bible would say the answer is to submit these drives and instincts to Christ and express them within a God-ordained marriage. Society's answer to the tension is remove the restrictions and give full rein to sexual expression. Okay. Anything else you want to say about Freud? You can see how Freud has taken over. Whole of society marches in step to Freud, particularly in his understanding of psychosexual tension and turmoil. So a Christian man comes to you and he has a habit of watching pornography, for instance, okay, and he says to you, well, you know, I have these natural desires, okay? and the expectations of family or church or spouse or church, you see, is unreasonable. You know, she needs to accept the fact that, you know, a lot of men watch pornography, it doesn't really mean anything, and she's sitting there and there's smoke coming out of her ears. You just can't believe what she's hearing. See, and you see, he's bought into this to this Freudian view of sexuality, that because it's natural here, then these restrictions are unreasonable. Well, it's Freudian, it's not biblical. Okay, well look, let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about Erik Erikson. You know, the individuals responding, their development comes from the way they respond to these inner drives and urges from within. Erikson said, no, it comes from the way they respond to what's happening without. Not within, but from without. Now, so Freud spent all his life looking at how we respond to what's going on inside. Erikson spent all his life looking at what goes on the outside. And of course the Bible handles both quite well, actually. The Bible talks about outward behaviour and relationships. The Bible has a lot to say about relationships, a lot to say about the inward, the heart. So Freud had the leg of the elephant, and Erikson had another part of the elephant, and thought they had the whole picture. Hence, Erikson's theories are termed psychosocial, whereas Freud's are psychosexual. And because they were psychosocial, you see on this diagram, on this handout here, Erikson's can go all the way through the the lifespan, because we are social creatures all the way through. We continue to respond to our environment till the very end of our life. Hence, he observed these stages all the way through. He saw the crucial motivator as not drive gratification, as in Freud, but relationship to caregivers and resultant attachment. Also, unlike Freud, he saw this development continuing on throughout a person's entire life. Now, this handout here is just going to give you a little more detail, the stages that Erikson has identified. Known as the 8 ages of man. So just looking at that handout for a moment, birth to 18 months, basic trust versus mistrust. Now Erikson spent hours and hours and hours observing people, observing children and infants, and based on these observations he came up with these labels for each stage of the lifespan. Basic trust versus mistrust, and then the next one, autonomy versus shame or doubt. And basically what he's saying is, if one doesn't happen, the other will happen. So from birth to 18 months, if the child doesn't learn basic trust, it'll come to the end of that span with mistrust. And moving into the next span, you see, if this is birth to 18 months, if he doesn't go from, if he doesn't lose his basic trust and go into mistrust, then he will go into childhood with autonomy. If he goes and if he goes with mistrust, then in childhood that'll surface as shame and doubt. If he goes with basic trust, that'll surface in childhood as autonomy. And you see childhood there is he's divided the childhood up into those different stages before you get to adolescence. So if one doesn't happen, the other. It's, if you like, think of it as a task. If the infant doesn't learn the task of basic trust, in other words, if the child is in an environment where the basic trust he might have in his mother from the time of his birth is broken down because of neglect in childhood, then he goes into the 18-month, 3 years with that mistrust in place, and that will leave within the child shame and doubt as to where his trust can be centered. For instance, Erickson would have a mother leave her infant in a room, and then have her leave the room and see what the infant does. And the infant, if the infant starts crying and get really upset, and mother comes back and the infant stops crying and settles right down, then Erickson would say, there is basic trust. There is basic trust. But if the mother went out of the room and the child barely noticed her absent and just carried on playing or doing whatever what it's doing, and when the mother came back in, the child barely noticed, then he would say there's a mistrust there of the mother, and the child is beginning to look within him or herself for its contentment. See? Beginning to trust in themselves, their ability to be in that room by themselves. So, just looking at this handout I've just given you on the 8 ages of man with corresponding concepts, about halfway down the first page, or page 3 as it is, about halfway down. Basic trust and mistrust. The infant's first social achievement, that is, his willingness to let the mother out of his sight without undue anxiety or rage, because she has become an inner certainty as well as an outer predictability. Then autonomy versus shame and doubt. Muscular maturation sets the stage for experimentation with two simultaneous acts of social modalities, holding on and letting go. To hold on can become a destructive and cruel retaining or restraining, and can become a pattern of care to have and to hold. To let go too can turn into an amicable letting loose of destructive forces, or it can become a relaxed to let pass and to let be. See, sounds like potty training, doesn't it? So there, you see, he's also drawing out the social consequences of how the child handles that stage and how they get through it. Initiative versus guilt, the ambulatory stage, it's walking, I guess, and that of infantile genitality, add to the inventory of basic modalities that of making first in the sense of being on the make. A sense of guilt is the risk because of the goals contemplated in the acts initiated. So 3 to 6, the child's having some goals for his life, goals for his play, for instance, and whether he pursues those goals with a sense of guilt or whether he pursues those goals with a healthy sense of initiative. It will depend on what happened in the previous stage, whether he came through that previous stage with a healthy sense of autonomy or with an unhealthy sense of shame and doubt. So if you're in a counselling situation, you see, and say you spend a lot of time counselling with children and with parents with small children, you might want to do some research on how you can help the parent to help the child to move through those stages with basic trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, and set them up for an adulthood of intimacy and genitivity and ego integrity. And a book on Erickson will give you all those definitions of all those labels he dreamt up. Okay. So Erickson divided the lifespan into 8 primary stages and suggested that healthy human development is based on the individual's ability to face and then successfully resolve the crisis or task at each stage. You see the adolescent one there, 13 to 23, identity versus role confusion. Anyone who's spent any time around teenagers knows that's a huge one. The teenagers' self-understanding of themselves, their confidence about being in their world, or whether there's just huge confusion about their place in the world, their place in the family, for instance. They find their place among their peers rather than their family of origin. You see, they're trying to work out their identity. And how can we ensure that our children come through adolescence? Well, Erickson would say go all the way back to the beginning. Basic trust, autonomy, initiative, industry leads to identity in adolescence. And then you see it leads in 24 to 34. They're able to establish a relationship of intimacy rather than isolation, which means they're unable to establish close relationships, and which sets them up for a lifetime of productivity and integrity, versus isolation, stagnation, and despair. If one doesn't happen, the other will. Okay, what do you think about that? You think about where you are on Erickson's stage there, and think about where you are right now in your life and whether you identify with those labels, and then you think about your recent past and some of these others. And do you identify with any of those labels and their descriptions? You have to do this for your paper, remember? This is what your paper's all about. Taking a lifespan and talking about it.
There's certainly exterior practice involved within those periods.
Is what factors?
I mean, you said Erickson's focus it sort of included that the emphasis on outward.
Right, social environment.
Social outward pressures.
Yeah.
I'd agree that within each of those stages there are outward pressures.
Right.
And so when looking at some of those pressures, some of the labels kind of fit a little bit, but there's certainly more than what he describes. Certainly not the full picture.
Right, right. So he's dealing with the outer, the environment in which we live.
Yes.
Right.
He's kind of making some big generalizations. And,
Yes.
And he's getting some things right.
Right.
He's observing some
Right.
things that tend to be true.
Yes. And obviously there's more to it. There's the internal stuff as well. And then when we look at Piaget, there's the cognitive, what's going on in our development of our brains. Okay, we're looking at Erickson's stages. I'm 62, so that puts me at that bottom one. And ego, integrity versus despair. And at 62 years of age, Erickson would say that if I hadn't handled well the previous stages, I would come to this stage of my life and be in despair. I would be in despair over the failures of the past that brought me to this despair. I'd be in despair about my immediate future. Have I provided for my retirement? Am I in despair about the prospect of retirement? And what about beyond? Most people don't expect or plan to live into their 80s. Most people don't actually plan much beyond when they finish work. So as I stand here before you, am I in despair, or do I could be described as having ego integrity? Now this part of me here, you see, this conscious behavior, is there integrity about the way I live, about the way I work, about the way I relate? Is there an integrity there which is based on a lifetime of successfully performing these tasks as I respond to my social environment? And now, you see, you're leaving out the spiritual, you see. Regardless of how much guilt I might feel about my past, as I stand before you as someone who's been saved in Jesus Christ, whose sins are forgiven, and who an unimaginable glory is promised for my future. So, sorry, Mr. Erickson, there can be no despair, regardless of all my failures to perform these tasks well back here. However, his observation is, mainly with a non-Christian population, was there was a lot of despair. And you go into the rest homes and you have despair everywhere. Guilt and shame.
Generally speaking, you can certainly see it in society. Like middle-age crisis is sort of that whole stagnation thing that people don't feel they're generating.
Okay, 35 to 60, middle-age crisis, okay.
Yeah, if they don't feel that they're achieving maybe what they once dreamed
Right.
they would, or they're not going to leave a legacy that they thought they would, then
Right.
they're looking to a future of despair. I guess they sense that.
Okay.
So that kind of creates a crisis.
So they might have feel that they've stagnated. Say a person in, say, 45 to 55 might have feel they've stagnated in their lives. So what does the guy do? He goes out and buys a red racing car and, starts wearing clothes that are more appropriate for a 25-year-old, you see, and we call that a midlife crisis. Well, Erickson would say he's trying to overcome a sense of stagnation and is trying to regenerate his impact on his world, particularly on his relationships. I think probably here the expectation is that in that stage the children are pretty much independent of the parents, and now the parents are faced with a stagnation. 24 to 34, I'm moving into dangerous ground here. This is where some of you are. And you see intimacy versus isolation. Now, 24 to 34 is those years of marriage and having children and raising children right through to here, around about here. And there, Erickson is saying that people who don't do that well, who find those relationships breaking down, family relationships breaking down, marriage relationships breaking down, they find themselves in isolation relationally rather than in intimate relationships. And he would say, well, that relates back to the adolescence and role confusion, and they came into adult relationship already in a role confused state and didn't really have any idea how to socially engage, how to maintain relationships in the long term.
See a lot of that now. When did he work on this? In the 50s or something?
It's probably in Berger. Berger will have it in your bibliography.
Because, that's sort of not happening till another 10 years now.
Right. So there was some shifts. Some shifts.
But
so
because of role confusion, people putting it off, I think.
So if you were counselling an adolescent, sorry, what was that?
So 1902 to 1994, he was.
Okay. So, right, he's probably doing his best work around the 70s or 80s. So if you were counselling an adolescent, for instance, 13 to 23, identity and role confusion, you probably wouldn't be counselling them with the issues that would apply to the 35 to 60 year age group. You wouldn't be talking to them about stagnation. They probably wouldn't be struggling with stagnation type issues. They're struggling more with role confusion. Similarly, if you're 35 to 60 or even 24 to 34, you'd be asking questions about their closest relationships and the relationships with their children, probably adolescent, young adult children, their relationships with their spouse or spousesses, depending how many they've had. And you see, you wouldn't be asking them questions about identity versus role confusion, or industry versus inferiority. Now, that's the presenting problem. See, they present 24 to 34, the presenting problem is their spouse has left. The father has left the home, for instance. He's left the marriage, you see, and here's this woman left with these kids, and 24 to 34, she's kind of an early adulthood, and she's wondering how she can cope. Now, you may ask some questions that go back here, or even back to her family of origin, to see how she's coped in the past with crises, to see what kind of support group she has, whether the family of origin can provide any supports for her for this time, and whether they can or not will largely depend on the kind of relationship she has with them. What kind of relationship she had in childhood and adolescence with her family of origin. Is she now on her own? And so you may have to help her go back and repair some of these relationships with her family of origin if she's to get the help she needs now that she's on her own with these children. You see that? It's suddenly it becomes very significant. Well, let's talk briefly about attachment theory. John Bowlby, like Freud and Erikson, Bowlby assumed the root of human personality lies in early childhood. They would say that the personality is laid down right here. That's why they put. That's why there's been so much done and written on early childhood. That's why there's such the focus in New Zealand, for instance, the last 10 years on early childhood education. Huge resources put into early childhood education. So much has been written on infancy and conception. You know, turning on nice music while you're carrying the baby, because the baby can hear the music. You see, and so the baby is born with already beginning to develop because of the external stimuli. And the theory is that this is when personality is laid down, and there's a determinative aspect of personality which then sets them up for the rest of their life. Now, I don't personally believe that's biblical, but however, that's Freudian psychotherapy. So now Bowlby was looking at what happens with attachment with the mother in infancy. Significant failure or trauma in the relationships of this period, early childhood, will shape the child's development. This is Bowlby talking. Bowlby focuses attention on the child's first attachment to the mother because it is the earliest and arguably the most central. In utero, the child is physically attached to the mother, and when the child is born, that physical attachment is broken, but the emotional attachment becomes very, very strong. He believed the mother-child attachment began in the womb with the baby becoming aware of the mother's smell, movement, and voice. Childbirth is the infant's first experience of pain. Childbirth is the infant's first experience of pain. Now, we know all about the labour that the mother endures, but Bowlby is saying that here in the womb, the child is safe and pain-free environment. And then suddenly, without warning, its little head has been forced down the birth canal and the child comes out screaming. That's a brand new experience for the baby. Never had that before. Screaming. And not only screaming, it's now out in a world which isn't warm and safe and snuggly and intimate and close and everything that was in utero. And so what's the first thing they do with the newborn once it's cleaned up is they give it immediately to the mother to embrace. You see how that attachment is so powerful right at the very beginning, the first moments of the child's life outside of the womb. The mother is the one it goes back to because it's the mother the child has come from, so it's the mother the child must go back to. Okay, so what happens when a child is taken away from its mother at birth for whatever reason? The mother doesn't want the child, she's not married, she's 15 years of age, and the child's going to be adopted out, and so the child is born, its first experience of pain, and the attachment to the mother that it had in utero has been broken, and now the child is screaming with pain. The child, according to the theory, is looking for its mother's comfort, but instead it's removed from its mother and placed in a nursery or placed with strangers, and you have what Bowlby would call a attachment disorder. So first experience of pain, and this pain is associated with the mother, hence the immediate need for the mother's comfort and reassurance. It's the mother that caused this pain. That's the theory goes. The child is born and it's the mother that's brought about this painful experience, therefore the mother is the one that reassures the child. And again, you see, with adoption, what happens? The child grows up angry at the mother's rejection, angry that the mother gave them away. How could she carry me for 9 months and then just not want to have anything more to do with me? And so adoption issues, and you might get to counsel people with adoption issues, the anger and the grief at having lost the mother issues which may not surface until, you know, middle age. Bowlby conducted experiments with mothers and small babies. Stranger danger, for instance, at 8 months demonstrated a healthy attachment to the mother. So he would set up scenarios where the mother would leave the room and a stranger would come in. And if the child was really upset, and the stranger went out and the mother came in, and the child settled right down, he would demonstrate a healthy attachment to the mother. And he had other ways, other little experiments of doing that. Difficulty in establishing healthy relationships, including codependent relationships, later in life was considered a consequence of attachment disorder in infancy. Now, codependent relationship in adult life is a relationship that you form with someone because of your awareness of your neediness, and you need them in your life in order to be able to live life yourself. You don't feel you can live life without them being in your life, so you form a codependent relationship. That's one form of an unhealthy relationship, but difficulty in establishing healthy relationships. Generally, Bowlby would say, so this would surface perhaps here, but certainly here, not able to establish healthy long-term relationships. He would say that an attachment disorder in infancy left the child in a state of mistrust. You see that in Erickson? An attachment disorder in birth to 18 months results in mistrust. Adoption's an obvious one. Mistrust. But even if the child stays with its natural mother but is not well cared for, is left alone for long periods of time and left alone to cry and so on, there's a mistrust and a shame and a doubt and a guilt and an inferiority, a confusion, and then we come to here, isolation, difficulty in forming healthy relationships. So maybe, you see, you have to ask questions about relationships with family of origin. And so if they're having difficulties in their marriage, for instance, if they're having difficulties developing a healthy marriage relationship, then it may be that they have had difficulty with relationships generally. And if there's a pattern there, it may be that to go back and to heal relationships back here means they could bring that back into their marriage and be more settled, be more content, more at peace, perhaps more patient, more forbearing. Although Bowlby's theory is not a full-fledged stage theory of development in the manner of Freud or Erickson, it's nonetheless based on many of their underlying psychoanalytical assumptions on the psychological clock. So the psychological clock refers to that inner drive we have, and he would say that attachment theory is related to what goes on inside of us, that inside of us there's not a healthy development relationally, and so we're always on the lookout for someone who can make up what we've lost, who can make up in this stage, for instance, what we've lost back here. Or an adolescent who lives a sexually promiscuous lifestyle, for instance, as an adolescent, trying to make up for something they've lost back here. And so in middle age, as soon as the children leave home, they divorce in middle age, and it shows that the relationship never really developed strong and healthy to sustain them, past when the children were at home, and so what happened back here? See, I need to go back and find out what went wrong in the relationship. So attachment theory is children that are left, babies that are left in orphanages, for instance, find it very hard to attach to adults. Stories of people who go to Romania to adopt a baby and bring them back, and this baby's been in the orphanage since birth, and they're now 3 years of age, and they bring them home. The child has no idea how to relate socially, is full of mistrust. The child is never held. The child lies in the cot, is never picked up, is never held, is kind of fed without any kind of tenderness or emotional connection. Bowlby would say that's an attachment disorder is developing. When counselling relational disorder problems, the knowledge and insight gained from considering attachment disorders can be both distressing and assuring for the seeker. Distressing because it may take them back to experiencing early trauma, thus increasing their fears and anxieties. but reassuring in that it provides an explanation as to why they feel themselves to be different from others in a social setting, and or why they find it difficult to form relationships, especially with peers and older parent-type authority figures. For an example, here you have someone who was adopted at birth, and they learn about that somewhere through here. They learn that they're an adopted child, and when they get to adolescence, and they're starting to interact with other children and other families outside of the family of origin, and they're realizing that, you know, a lot of these other children are with their natural parents, but they're not, and suddenly the whole adoption thing becomes a bit of an issue, and early adulthood, and somewhere along in here comes the desire to reconnect with the birth mother, usually the birth mother. Isn't that interesting? See, attachment disorder with the mother, usually with the birth mother, and so what they're trying to do then in these relationships is they're trying to get what they lost back here, and the difficulty is they can't get what they lost back here. They can't get it in their other adult relationships. See, that's why they have to find the mother. That's why adoption laws have now changed, so that adopted adult children can have access to records and try to find their adoptive parents. Now, that law change came as a result of Bowlby's theories on attachment disorder. That if this adult can go back and reconnect with the birth mother, then, and however that meeting goes, the very fact that they've connected will help them to come to terms with the reality of who they are and what happened to them in that detachment. So, you know, those programs on TV, Missing Pieces, and, you know, where they do that, don't they? They go back and all the trauma associated with that, that's attachment disorder. Now, that's why you see it can be distressing and reassuring. Now, so here's a teenager or early adult who's having really difficulty trusting people in relationships. And they wonder why that is. You know, why am I like that? You know, people around me seem to be able to fall in love, and you know, and you know, it's all very mutual, and it just seems to work for them. But I'm just so cautious about all of that. You see, I'm afraid of that, or I'm afraid to let go, I'm afraid to trust, or I'm just not sure. You see, I just you know, and well, you might ask them some questions about attachment disorder. Ask them about their relationships in their family of origin from when they were very young. Now, they may not have been adopted, but they may have experienced emotional deficits in their infancy and in their childhood. Emotional deficits which left them feeling unsure about themselves. If my parents did not love me well, what does that say about me? Am I unlovable? Is there something wrong with me? And see, the purpose of the counselling is to reassure them there's actually nothing wrong with them. They're actually quite normal. The problem is with their parents who deprive them of the emotional connection that they needed and should have had. You can see why it'd be difficult to form relationships with older parental type authority figures, because they remind them of the parent who launched them into adult life with all those emotional deficits. One way you see this is, and we're going to look at this when we come to adolescence. I'll give you something to read called Absent Fathers, Angry Sons, written by New Zealand sociologists looking at the New Zealand scene. So the father leaves the family at an early age. So the son grows up without a father, and the son grows up angry, and then the son, it comes into adulthood, finds it almost impossible to connect with older men in his life, whether it's in the church or at his place of work. He's always having run-ins with his boss, you know, because he, you know, in his anger and in his autonomy, he has sought to tell himself that if he has to learn to live without a father figure in his life, otherwise he won't survive. So he learns to live with that, or he thinks he has, and he comes into early adulthood, and now he's in a job, and he's got a boss there who's probably as old as his father might have been, and this guy finds it impossible to relate to him. Why? There's a transference going on. The anger he feels to the absent father, and the absent father's not around for this anger to be expressed, now gets transferred onto this father-type figure, or this authority figure in his life. And of course, it's impossible for the relationship. He has to quit the job because this guy has no idea why the boys are angry with him. And you see, it just triggers something that's been down there for a long time in his heart. And so if you're counselling somebody like that, if you're counselling a young man, say, adolescent or early adulthood, whose father left the family when he was very young, and now he's talking to you, and say you are a man, say he's talking to one of us guys here, and we're in a counselling situation. You see, he's now talking to a father figure. He's now talking to an adult male who's older and is in a position of authority over him as a counsellor to a client, or as a helper to a seeker. Now, you may think at first glance, well, you're an absolutely wrong person to be trying to help him. Well, that depends on you, really. If you're able to maintain a non-anxious presence and bear with this young man as he gives vent to all his anger, and he directs his anger against you, and you're there. Unlike his father, you're not going to disappear on him. You are going to stay there, you see? And what you're giving him is a taste of what it's like to relate to an older man where there's trust, where there's love, where there's commitment, where there's integrity. You see, and already now the counselling relationship is part of that young man's healing, regardless of what you actually say to him in the therapy. The relationship itself is his first taste of being in a relationship with an older man, a father figure, and it's therapeutic in the extreme. Now, you see, with an understanding of this sort of thing, you see how you're able to step into the life of that young man and begin to give him a taste of something that for him is like the elixir of life. And you know, for his anger to begin to shrink down to more manageable size so it doesn't dominate and paralyze his life and his social engagements. Our society is full of angry young men, and the counselling needs are huge. And this new understanding, it's a new understanding that the seeker gains as you talk with them, can often be the beginning of life change as seekers begin to move against their fears and anxieties, grieving their losses, and finding new hope in the promises and graces of the gospel. So if this young man is a Christian, for instance, and you bring him, his relationship with you is bringing him face to face with all his anger and concerning an absent father, and it's affected his relationship with God, you know, father figure, you know, it's all in the mix, and now he's relating to you, and as a basis of that relationship he can begin to reconnect with God as his father and come to terms with the fact that his own father is absent in his life, and he begins to see that in a new reality where he can grieve his loss. Instead of being angry over the loss, he begins to grieve his loss. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Not blessed are those who are angry. Because the angry young man is seeking to provide his own comfort through his anger. He finds comfort in his anger and his hatred. But if he can, before the cross, he grieves his loss. And the promise of Christ there is that those who mourn will be comforted. And so the comfort of Christ comes to the one who is grieving their losses rather than angrily rejecting their losses. So that's why I've got this little quote here in italics: "Grief is letting go of false hopes in order to live honestly and authentically." And in that situation, you see, what's the false hope? The false hope is that I can live without a father in my life. We were created for a relationship with our Heavenly Father. None of us can live without God the Father in our lives. This young man believes he can because for 18 years he's done it, right? That's a false hope, that I can live without a father. He has to let go of that false hope and to live honestly. To live honestly is to say, yes, I've experienced a huge loss but God is my Father and He will never leave me. That's to live honestly. To live authentically is to go into his own relationships with older men, not with anger, not with hatred, not with wanting to make them pay, but authentically that says, I have a hole in my heart that only a father can fill, and I'm not going to look to you, older man, to fill that hole because only he can, but nevertheless I'll relate to you as a brother in Christ. The seeker cannot go back and redo the attachment stage of their infancy. They can only take their losses and wounds to the Lord. Jude 24. Now Jude 24 is, we know it most as a doxology at the end of the church service. But I think the promise in Jude 24 is a very, very valuable promise. If you're talking to someone, say here, and you're urging them to go back and look at the painful losses of infancy and childhood, and you're going to go back with them. Remember, a trauma that's not comforted is a trauma that remains. Now remember, we talked about this last week. The reason you're going to go back with them to this part here, and you're going to re-traumatize them so that you can comfort them. Now that's going to take place in the safety of the counselling relationship, of the counselling environment. You see, and as they go back there, you go back with them, and there in the midst of that trauma, you are standing there as a father figure to bring them the comfort as they go back and relive for a moment what it was like to realize that the father had gone. And as you do that, you see the promise is here in Jude 24, to him who is able to keep you from falling. See, that young man has been falling all his life. Since the father left, he's been falling all his life without a father to hold him up, to affirm him, to bless him, to encourage him. He's been falling. The promise in Jude 24 is there is a father. There is a father who will keep you from falling, young man. So go back. Go back, and together we'll look at that again. And as you go back, know that he will keep you from falling. This will not be an undoing of your life. God will keep you from falling, and he will present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. Now, see, here's the thing. This young man whose father left when he was a child is left wondering, was it my fault? Did he leave because was I a naughty little boy? Did he not love me? Did he not like me? Is that why he left? That's what a child says, right? Now, as he grows older, you know, he gets told by others, no, you know, or he may not be told by others, depends what people around him are like. You see, he may grow up, you see, and you see this wonderful promise from the Heavenly Father. God will present that young man before himself without fault and with great joy. Now, see, that's exactly what every good father should do with a son, isn't it? Present the son to himself. Embrace the son and without fault and with great joy. So the child, the boy's not left wondering, does my father love me? Is there something wrong with me? Is some fault with me? Does he really love me? Does he really enjoy me? Does he joy over me? This Jude 24 is a promise for a young man who's experienced an attachment disorder. And the counselling relationship may be his first taste of a human relationship where he can look at the truth and not fall, and his heart not fail. Psalm 62:8. It's another reference I have there. Psalm 62:8. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. This is a verse that I go back to time and again, both in my lectures and in my counselling and in my own struggle to live life in a fallen world. Notice there's a progression there. Trust in him at all times. Well, how do you trust in God? By pouring out your heart to him. Now, you don't pour your heart out to someone you don't trust. If you say you trust God, then pour your heart out to him and find that Jude 24 is real. He will not let you fall. You pour your heart out to him, that means you become vulnerable. Someone who pours their heart out is someone who's not hanging on and trying to make it all work in their own strength. They're pouring their heart out and making them vulnerable. So as they pour their heart out to God, the promise is God will not let them fall. Rather, they will find God to be their refuge, their hiding place. So, God will not be your hiding place unless you pour your heart out to him. If you don't pour your heart out to God, it's because you've found your own resting place, which is yourself. So what we're doing here, you see, as we go back, you see, we're trusting God as we go back. And as we go back and face the grief and the loss, so there's a pouring out of our hearts to God. Lord, all my life I've been struggling with this huge emptiness in my heart, and I blamed you for it, and I blamed other people for it, and I blamed myself, and I don't know what to do with it, and it's just, Lord, it's more than I can bear. See, pouring my heart out before God. And then God's promises, God's gospel promises come to that young man, and he finds that God is his refuge in the promises of the gospel. And so, you see, he may never reconnect with his earthly father. And that is an ache that will remain with him for the rest of his life, but it won't immobilize him. It won't overwhelm him. It won't sink him. He can still live and love with integrity in ways that honour God. In other words, you can help him with the rest of his lifespan, the rest of his transitions. Isn't that a glorious thing? Instruments in the hands of the Redeemer. Okay, well, anything you'd like to say, we've got a couple of minutes, about Erik Erikson and attachment theory.
How did, I mean, if I understand the last paragraph, the way it's worded.
Uh-oh.
No, it's not the wrong word. I just understand it.
The last paragraph.
Yeah, it says this view understanding.
That refers to the previous paragraph.
So you're assuming that the attachment there is right, and then that, by reading that, and then therefore you can be magically find hope and help.
It's all done with mirrors. Smoke and mirrors. Stay long enough, we'll tell you how to do smoke and mirrors. Now, it's not, see, I'm not telling you all this because I assume it's right and biblical. I'm telling you all this because it's the fruit of many people, intelligent people, making observations for a long period of time of a lot of people, and coming up with theories that our society believes in and have changed their laws to accommodate those theories. And so you're going to have people coming to you that are aware of these theories, thinking about them. So someone comes to you and he says, and you say, you know, what have you come to see me for? He says, well, I've got adoption issues. And we don't want to say there's no such thing because it's not in the Bible. Just, you know, let me tell you again about the gospel. You see, if a person's not well loved at any stage of their life, that will have consequences. Now, all Bowlby's done is identify a period where children have not been well loved and have seen some downstream consequences. So the new understanding is an understanding that failures to be loved well, or emotional deficits in my life when I was a child, may be having an impact on my struggles in the present. It's not the whole answer. It's not the whole answer, obviously. But remember, the truth about me is everything about me from beginning to end. So if something happened to me back here, then that's as true about me as whatever I'm struggling with now. And so we want to know what's true. We want to know the truth. And so you're going to give that person an insight into what is true about them. And so they're going to go away and say, that is true about me. And if it's true about them, it's a good thing for them to know. It's a good thing to know what's true about my life.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people confused or screwed up because they they actually haven't identified what they've lost, and they haven't counted, or they might have been told or know that, you know, lost their father early, or, you know, but they haven't actually sat down and reflected on, well, what happened to me, you know, what did I miss out on, you know, and that's all involved with forgiving yourself, forgiving the person. If you sort of just, oh well, that's, you know, I just need to get over it, or if they believe those kind of lies, then they can't actually, in some ways the gospel is hard to apply to them because they don't know what to forgive whoever for.
And they just may have a heart of anger.
Yeah.
Mark, just coming back to your last paragraph, do you want to say some more about that?
No, I think that's a good.
Okay.
It's a good failure to be loved well, because this old John Bowlby seems to get quite sidetracked in all this detail about a particular issue about attachment, particularly the baby. I think a lot of it's irrelevant. Some of it may be, but relevant. But if you look at someone who's been adopted, they do have issues.
They do.
And it's not necessarily how old John reckons it to be, but it's that awareness when they become a certain age that their parents, their birth parents or birth mother rejected them,
Yes.
or gave them up for a reason. And
Right.
there's that feeling of not being loved.
Exactly. And if you're counselling people with adoption issues, you might want to do some research and read some books on adoption issues. Now, if you're reading secular literature on adoption issues, they're going to talk about it in terms of attachment theory. And whether you want to make that connection or not, that's the connection they're making. And so, hence, you'll say, oh yes, I know about that. Reynolds talked about that. So, you know, it's really just to help you access the secular literature without necessarily having to believe everything they say. But that's how the secularists understand adoption issues in terms of attachment disorder. And you're right, Bowlby's very excited. You read anything that Bowlby's written, he's really feels like he's on to something. He's got the key.
But it's confusing when you read someone else's theory who says no, it's bollocks, and it has a completely different view. So it's like you're left often reading through these theories quite confused as to why you even bother reading them in the first place. But I think to be able to take it a step back and say,
Yes.
this is a failure to be loved, and then when you go and look at the detail, then it doesn't matter if they've put it on nail. You can see the perspective from
Yes. You know, someone who has perhaps adopted person has read a book on adoption issues and suddenly diagnoses themselves, I've got adoption issues, they might go and consult Dr. Google and Google and adoption issues, and what comes up is attachment theory. And so they're now, you see, this is how their self-understanding goes along these lines. Then they come and talk to you, and you need to be able to take them from where they are with an understanding of where they are and take them in a gospel direction.
I mean, some of these theories might be right, but they can be useful because they start your thinking and pulling apart their issues and that.
Even if they get us thinking, you see, and they get us thinking about these things, and well, let's go back to the scriptures then and develop our own response to these issues of not being well loved. Okay, well, we better stop there because we're out of time. Let me just pray for you. Father God, you have a heart of love for us that is without measure, which we cannot plummet the depth of, and you have lavished that love upon us. From the time we were spiritually reborn as Christians, you have loved us in our spiritual conception, and you have loved us in our spiritual infancy and childhood, and you have spared nothing from us. You have been a good and a gracious Father. you have provided for us in so many ways. And Father, as we look back on our life and we see the failures of human people as well as the wonderful experiences we've had from human people, we know, Father, that all of it is just a foreshadowing of the love that you have for us. And Lord, our prayer tonight is that as we look back on our own lives and see the deficits wherever they are, that they would drive us not to our own solutions and our own medications and our own self-comfort, but they would drive us to you, Father God, in whom there is no deficits. And you can fill us with inexpressible joy and the hope of an unimaginable glory. And Lord, we pray that you would continue to grow and develop our hearts and our understanding of ourselves and of the hearts of others, so that you could perhaps use us in the life of one who is struggling with the effects of living in a fallen and sinful world, and encourage them in ways that bring them and their losses and their griefs and their anger and their hatreds and their despair and to Jesus Christ, and know the fullness of his life and of his joy. We ask these things in Christ's holy and precious name.